Hi everyone, I'm Wenny Teo, lecturer in modern and contemporary art at the Courtauld Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to our second event in this year's Frank Davis lecture series, Asian Art After Quarantine. This is a series of dialogues and conversations centered on Chinese and British Chinese diasporic artistic experience in a turbulent year marked by citywide quarantines and isolation, a scarcity of funding and public platforms for the arts, the unmasking of institutional structures of racism and anti-Asian violence. Needless to say, the global pandemic has clearly necessitated a rethinking of art's organizational infrastructures. But beyond institutional declarations of solidarity and Instagram Black squares, what does this work actually involve? How does an organizational body reconfigure itself? And how might an ethos of critical care be mobilized toward a radical reconfiguration of the artistic and curatorial conscience? So here to respond to these important questions are our two speakers, the artist JJ Chan and curator and researcher Sunshine Wong. Hi JJ, hi Sunshine, who I now have the pleasure of introducing. So JJ Chan is an artist working across and amid sculpture, moving image, and writing. Their work draws from lived experience and stories stolen from eavesdropped conversations. At the foundation of JJ's work and research is an investigation of portraiture and self-portraiture, which stakes out new cartographies of gender, identity, and collecting, sited at the boundaries between the authentic and the imaginary. Joining JJ in conversation today is Sunshine Wong, an art worker, researcher, and facilitator. Sunshine worked as an art teacher in Hong Kong, where she was born and raised, before relocating to Berlin, where she completed her MA in curated events as part of the 91 MQ collective. Her current research interests include art-making infrastructures, critical care approaches, and co-vulnerabilities in times of contagion. Sunshine is curator at Bloc Projects in Sheffield, which JJ and Sunshine will be talking about a bit more today, regional editor for Corridor 8, and irregularly convenes a slow reading group called TLDR for anyone who has a complicated relationship with working in the arts, which I think is basically everyone who works in the arts. So JJ and Sunshine will be speaking for about 45 minutes to an hour, focusing on the desires, aims, and emergent processes of the 12-month residency program Blueprints for the Otherwise at Bloc Projects, after which they'll be taking questions from you, the audience. So please add your comments to the chat box. So handing over to you now, Sunshine.
Thank you for that introduction, Winnie. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm Sunshine, and I'll be speaking with JJ today on the residency program called Blueprints for the Otherwise, after which this talk is named. But before we do that, I was thinking, or in fact, JJ was suggesting that we do a little somatic grounding exercise. So this is something I've been doing for our webinar events at Bloc Projects. I find it to be quite useful to settle the room, to kind of shake off whatever moods and swirling of situations we have from the day, and to bring whatever kind of virtual room we have together. So you're more than welcome not to take part in it if it's not your thing, and just join back in a couple of minutes. But if so, then I invite you to do this with us. It's a really simple exercise. We can do a seated one. And this one that we're going to do today is, fancy name is the Retina Reset, but basically it's to rest your eyes a little bit. So what we can do to start with, if you're a glasses wearer, you can take your glasses off. I'm going to take mine off, so I won't be able to see anything for a bit. And rub your hands together to make them nice and warm. So once you've done that and your hands feel warm enough, take the fat padded parts of your hands and put them right over your eyes that are closed. So over your closed eyes. And you can just rest your elbows on the table, rest your head into your hands, and just let your eyes rest. And hopefully all you see right now is just an inky blackness, and you just feel the warmth of your palms against your forehead and your eyes. While you do this, you can take, let's say, 4 deep breaths in and out of your nose, and I will count us off. We can do 1 deep breath in and out through your nose. In again. And out. In. And out. Last one in. And out. Just give it a moment to let your breath settle. And then first, just take your hands away from your eyes, leaving your eyes closed. And feel the light coming back in through your eyelids. You can put your glasses on if you're like me, a glasses wearer, and then slowly open your eyes. So hopefully that helped. I think a lot of us have been on Zoom. I've been on Zoom all day today. How long have you been on Zoom today, JJ?
Zoom since 10 a.m. today.
I think I've had 4 Zooms today. This is my 4th one. But this will be a good one, JJ.
Yeah, I think so. So perhaps we should let you start and to introduce Bloc, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, we can do that. So yeah, Bloc is a small arts organization based in Sheffield. We're in South Yorkshire. I'm in South Yorkshire right now, even though you can't see, and all you see is my computer room, the multi-purpose room where everything happens. And Bloc has been around since 1996. Started off as a collection of studio spaces. And in 2002, Bloc Projects was born out of these Bloc studios. And Bloc Projects became, it sort of curated its own events. And it was a really, really small space next to the studios. Hi there, Uthra. In 2007, it became, 2002 was when Bloc Projects was born as an organization. 2007, I forgot what the milestone is of that. But anyway, in the last 3 or 4 years, Bloc has gained a little bit more of a profile, doing art exhibitions and programs. And in the last year or so, we've been thinking about the future of the organization, not only because we feel that we can take the next step in becoming more of a stable institution, organization, because so far we have been, like many organizations up and down the country, surviving on project grants that are only a year to 2 long. And overall is not a very sustainable way to do things or to think about the long term. So the last year was as tumultuous as it has been with COVID and with all the social and cultural upheavals. We haven't really had much time, or our program has had to be put on ice for a while. And we used this, we thought we would use this time to think about where we were headed. And a huge part of that has to do with responding to all of the things that were happening in the art worlds, calls for structural change, the calls for better infrastructure and better support for artists, which we as Bloc are in kind of uniquely placed to be able to respond to better, I think. I say Bloc as if it's like a big or some kind of like official organization, which we are, but we are also only 2 part-time staff members who run the place, working 3 days a week. So that's also the reality of it. My former colleague and I really wanted to think about the place and the work we were doing as an organization. And this is where JJ came in the picture earlier this year. We wanted to do a longer term residency to think about the machinery of delivery that is oftentimes very kind of short and intense, 3 to 4 month period of working on projects and then turning it over and turning it over. So you do feel like you're a bit in a bit of a hamster wheel of delivering things. And so one of the conscious decisions we made about this particular residency was to extend it to a year long. And for a long time, we were calling it the Longitudinal Residency. And it's only in the last month or 2 since announcing JJ's residency with us that we've come to call it Blueprints for the Otherwise, which actually came from a talk a few months back called Poetry is Not a Luxury, in which Saidiya Hartman, big fan, spoke. And she mentioned in context of abolitionist poetry, poetics rather, that we're constantly trying to create the conditions of the future in the now. And so Blueprints of the Otherwise is the way she kind of described it. And I was just like, oh, that's kind of stayed in the back of my mind for a long time. And somehow in our conversations, the initial conversations JJ and I were having, where I was trying to set the scene of what we were doing, this came to mind and felt very apt for what we were doing. So that's kind of the what's happening at the organization at the moment. And JJ, should we talk a little bit about our respective positions, I suppose, in the earlier part of this year before we came together?
Yeah, I think that would be worthwhile, because I think when I received your invitation to work with Bloc, I was, how do I say, I suppose, rather, I was distancing myself from arts organizations because I felt that arts organizations were a very difficult place currently for me to carve out a place to have a voice. And I also was in the midst of thinking, just trying to situate myself as a human being in the pandemic, and finding that my voice ordinarily that I use to make things with was more valuable often in speaking and writing. And I think I had just before that, I think it was just before that I wrote those words that are used in the description of this talk. And at that point there was a real, and I think not just from me, but there was a real hope, and not just a kind of passing hope, but a really not insignificant level of hope that somehow the systems and structures of the capital, or of this kind of aggressive capitalism, might finally now give us a break, and that we wouldn't be running this hamster wheel that you described there. And that given that it had shut down so quickly, maybe that it wouldn't come back, and it wouldn't come back at least in the same form. And and that somehow maybe the pandemic would be a leveler. And actually, I think that it turned out not to be a leveler at all. And that, there was the hope that somehow the conditions that we already anticipated were going to be very traumatic, the conditions of the lockdown would somehow, at least, if there was any positive, open up some kind of alternative path to the future, I think. And I don't know if that bit is naive, to be honest, but I think that I was also naive to think that there wouldn't be as much resistance to it as I encountered.
Yeah.
And there was so much of that, and it became very to seem to call for an emergence from global pandemic as something other than what already or the systems that had already been in place seemed like some kind of radical idea. So it was some sort of impossibility, and maybe that was in some parts naive, but I think there was a genuine hope that that could happen, and that was really felt in a lot of the ways that we spoke about the arts, at least.
I remember distinctly you saying that you had written that open letter to CFCCA, and then there was our approach coming to you, and that you seemed almost genuinely surprised by it. And then you thought, actually, this whole kind of like reaching out to institutions and suggesting things, and then saying structural change, needs to happen. It has to actually also come back from the institution to say, like, yeah, we want this to happen. You actually have to reach out from the perspective of the institution or the organization to say, yes, this needs to happen.
Yeah, I think
you're actually surprised by it.
I was really surprised, I think. Yeah, I think it's interesting because when we refer to the institution, it seems like this kind of abstract thing that is detached from people, and it felt quite evident at Bloc that what was the institution, or at least what was the organization, was at some point, in fact, just you on your own. And
at some point it was when Dave left, and I was like, oh, I am Bloc.
And so when it came to larger institutions, and there was this reference to this seeming like demigod of an institution that didn't somehow belong to anybody or any of the constituent parts of that institution, what I saw, at least, was that there was the pandemic had meant that there was a prioritization of that abstract idea of the institution detached of its people over the people, and suddenly it was a case that the survival of this institution was somehow prioritized over the lives of the people who were previously facilitating the work of it, who were delivering the work of the gallery or the museum, or producing the artwork and showing the artwork, putting the artwork on display. And somehow those jobs were struck off. And in the meantime, what we saw was the jobs of those who were maintaining the kind of survival of this empty thing were protected. And there was a real sense that I felt that at that point, not only had I stepped out of the institution, but that my peers were being kicked out of the institution. And I had a real connection, I suppose, even though, when I come to install a show, I'm surrounded by the peers that are around me are the technicians and the people who help me put the thing together, and that was also my role for a very long time until very recently, was as a technician. And so it felt it really counterproductive to that was somehow a disposable part of contemporary art, and I think that meant that I suddenly was like, well, this isn't really the space for me to make anything. How do we start to find places that are more suitable? And when your invitation came, it had come from an institution that was at a stage where it hadn't yet quite known what it was going to be. And that's how I sensed it anyway. Bloc Projects was on the cusp of becoming something, but didn't quite know where it wanted to go. And it felt like a space that could be open to a different kind of organizing, a different kind of
Sure.
a different kind of activity that would provide for making art and provide for an artworking that was engaged with its audience and its artists and its community that was around it. And I think that that's why it became, I think it became the only thing that I said yes to last year.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's funny that you mentioned that, that the transition point, and that we were kind of like still becoming that thing, and we're not really sure what that's going to look like. But what I do, just on a personal perspective, remember coming to Bloc years and years ago, just as a punter, you know, not like anyone who's got anything to do with this. I was living in Berlin still at the time, and just coming and seeing this really odd event. I just remember the atmosphere with these like kind of swinging glow, like light globes in this very kind of raw space, and then maybe some sort of vocal performance that was going on in the corner was just so weird. Like even for someone who's like pretty close, like in Berlin, there's these DIY shows are a dime a dozen, you know, and even for me then I thought that was a bit weird. I was like, wow, Bloc, you know, okay, this is interesting. And this is echoed by one of our board members as well, who had written this thing for Bloc when we turned 25 years ago. And then, yeah, just kind of this quite anarchic energy, close to the ground was what he said as well, and politically responsive. And these are things that when I heard them, I was just like, yeah, I kind of remember that as well. And it's something that we want to uphold somehow still through this transition. We don't want to lose the spirit, because it's been artist run and artist led this whole time. And there's a certain agility and a certain kind of quickness that we can move with. Precisely this, like last year, you know, all this stuff was going on, and we can actually make that decision just between the two of us. No, we got to do something about that. We got to, and then we did, and then we wrote a grant, and then now you're here. You know, like it's that sort of ability to move that I think these lumbering bigger organizations cannot, just by sheer weight of themselves.
Yeah, I think
it's something we're aware as we grow, that we don't want to get caught in this sort of like, we don't want to get caught in the molasses of well, we gotta ask so-and-so first about this, and then we gotta go ask this department about that. And it's just like, but then what happens to the work, you know?
Yeah, because I think that that stability that you mentioned at the very beginning this is where we have to start complexifying it, because actually that with stability comes these new challenges. And of course, with stability, you have a kind of level of resources perhaps that weren't available to you previously. But whether or not you can, and this is something we've spoken about too, that whether you can maintain a sense of liveness or a sense of wildness in something that is considered stable is also a difficulty. And this is not to suggest that arts organizations shouldn't be properly funded, but that we have to consider why somehow that having resources to make work or to engage with audiences somehow creates a situation that means that organizations are no longer agile or able to adopt new practices that correspond with things that are needed by the community that are around them or their audiences? How does it somehow develop this bureaucracy because of its proximity to resources? And I think that's the real challenge that that we begin to face as we try to, I suppose, expand what Bloc is.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is tied in, and we talk about this as well, don't we? Like the funding structures and I forget whether this was in our conversation last time, but I just thinking about the questions you have to answer on a very, very basic level, that you open like an ACE, Arts Council England, Grantium thing online, and you see these questions. And that, like, the question already kind of determines the field in which you can function. So you can't, it's like you, even though I believe all of these things, and the moment you have to like write this out, it becomes something else because of the way it's asked of you. So it's a really, really difficult kind of balance. It's, in fact, is an impossible thing to do, where you're struggling to maintain a certain level of resources in order to keep the organization going. And yet, you know, on the other hand, that some of these things you're doing it in a compromising sort of way in order to to attain those resources. So it really muddles you up. Like whatever you might, I mean, today I was just talking about it with my coworker, like how like when you work for something like the Arts Council, a body like the Arts Council, you might have, you know, come out of arts education or have certain ways of seeing things, and then you kind of stuck in this between a rock and a hard place, you know, and all of these things kind of become something else the moment you start having to speak in certain languages too, like about inclusivity and about audiences. And it's like all these categories that in real life are never as clearly distinct as that. Like at the moment, one big thing that we're trying to do at Bloc is not think about audiences, think about publics. Mm-hmm. Who, and this is something that you're helping us think through a lot, you know, and bringing back into our field of vision, Bloc Studios, which is right next door. Maybe that's something that we can talk about too, no?
Yeah, I think that's really relevant, I think, because I think this is maybe where we can start speaking about this idea of an ethos of care or critical care, and how we begin to nurture something that might be considered a healthy organization. I think maybe that's an incorrect use of the term if it's used elsewhere, but something that is a kind of healthy set of relations between what is the organization and its immediate community, which is, of course, the publics and these people who are around it, who are producing the content, the art workers and the artists. And what, you know, with Bloc, so I don't know if people don't know Bloc Projects is situated nestled in between this studio complex, and surrounding the gallery space are I don't know how many, like 30, 40?
60, in fact.
Artists, right? There's 60 artists, an entire community, a village full of artists that surround this space, which is designated for platforming artwork. And when we started this conversation, the relationship between those two groups of people, or that space and the artists and residents around there, was a little bit it didn't really exist, I suppose. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Sunshine?
I think so. I think in the last few years, I mean, as soon as you kind of call yourself an entity, I think something happens to you. You've kind of consolidated that as you've created certain boundaries. Like we do projects here, and then you're the studios over there. And I think with also the changeover of people at Bloc, every 3-4 years or so, you might have a new person directing. Those relations can get further and further apart. And much to the credit to the last director, Dave, who I worked with very briefly before he left, he really tried to, not in a very formalized way, pull those relations back together, you know, offering the gallery space for people around us to use, specifically the studio holders, you know, just a lot of these very informal things, having cups of tea with people, borrowing equipment from us, all that sort of stuff. I think Wendy was asking in the chat to hear about this ethos of care. I think it really kind of, the beginnings of the conversation that Dave and I had last year was around these sort of relations, because for me, having joined in January, literally 2 months before the pandemic hit, I hadn't really seen any of this take place, only in a very sort of like minor way. We were quite busy with exhibition, again, that hamster wheel, you know, put our heads down, was you know, oh, there was this exhibition opening and there's that other one. Oh, I would wave a few people here and there, you know, seeing the studio holders come by and like borrowing like a circular saw or something. But then we suddenly had this time, like the programming stopped, everything stopped. And it was such a, like we could actually think, we could breathe, we could reflect on what Bloc is about, where we wanted to see it go in the future, which typically we had to carve out like these little pockets of time to do just so that we could do a grant for the next thing. So it's always just a matter of treading water, like, we can do this next thing, we can do this next. But we had this luxury of time to think about it, which is something we can talk about later as well, no? Because I think a lot of what we talk about is the sort of availability of time for you to help us think this through. Anyway, so it was the reflections on what was going on around us. We could actually discuss that, Dave and me. Yeah, these are the people who, this is Sean and this is so-and-so. And I was just starting to think like, wow, there are these people around us. And then also all that being, and against the backdrop, that's the word I was looking for, of all this upheaval happening in the cultural sector. You know, Jade Montserrat and Cecilia Wee and Michelle Williams-Gamick, who wrote that essay on Arts Professional about structural change, that was a real call to arms. And like outside of that, though, it was clear that some things needed to shift, and we wanted to make that really a deliberate thing. And so it's centered around this notion of critical care. We really wanted to put that critical in front of it, not to be like pretentious art people, but also to really hone in on the urgency of it. Recently, I heard a podcast with Patricia Hill Collins, who talks about like these dimensions of criticality, where like you've got the critical, really like urgent nature of things, plus the critical criticism, like being able to reflect on something, and then really bringing those two together. And whether, and we were trying to do that with critical care as a concept, not just sort of like presented as something that, oh, we need to think about it theoretically, but materially as well, and bring to fore the urgency.
Yeah, I think the word care was something that was used so much last year, because it was in the middle of a pandemic. We were all talking about care. How do we care for each other? And when it came somehow to the places where I was offering my labor to, that word seemed to mean something a little bit different to how it meant when I was speaking about my family members or my neighbors. And somehow care in an organizational or institutional sense was, rather than in reference to the body, perhaps, or maybe the body, I'm not quite sure, but in reference to ourselves, it was often used to refer to a kind of or health or care was used to speak about the kind of health of the institution somehow, or somehow that that the health of the institution was rather than the health of the people who make up that space. And there was this sense that really, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that there was a kind of priority, a different use of the word care and health when it came to institutions, meant that it was no longer about human survival, but rather about preserving some kind of economics in relation to art galleries and museums. And that it felt very similar to the way that there was a halt in the kind of, in general, in national economics that was prioritized over the health of its people. And that, I think, is because the organizational structures, or the ones that we are critiquing here, are somehow mirroring those larger ones. That somehow, I think also that, and maybe this is I think definitely different for Bloc, because Bloc has, and like you said, the position of it means that it can be agile, but it has an ability to be political. And that's because it doesn't have that stability. And more larger institutions somehow have to, or feel like they have to be apolitical or somehow non-political, which is not really a thing. This like non-politicality is in fact just a kind of acceptance to skirt along with the status quo, and actually that. I don't know about for anybody else, but this skirting along with the status quo for me appears to be some kind of conservatism. It certainly isn't something that's rooting for change or rooting for kind of shift or caring for the people that are the people who are the laborers in this situation.
And if I might just interject here very briefly, JJ and Sunshine, sorry. So I think, this idea of care and the kind of nuances of that, and this idea that you're responding to a kind of critical urgency in a sense, perhaps it'll be very useful for those of us who have not, who are perhaps not familiar with some of your writing and some of your thinking around this. If you could first, I think the word Sunshine used was a call to arms. And that's certainly how I came across both of you last year as well, having obviously followed your work before. But both of you, really formulated quite, strident, I won't use the word manifesto, but, you had real kind of critical concerns to do with institutional critique, right? About arts organizations in the UK. And you've talked variously about the kind of machinery of delivery and that kind of bureaucratic systems. But I was wondering if you could both speak a little bit about what your position was at that time, so that everyone can kind of understand the basis from which you are proposing, a more, the idea of an ethics of the ethos of care or an ethics of care. JJ, do you perhaps want to go first with what you wrote last year?
Yeah, so there were multiple things I wrote last year, but the first, I suppose, thing that I'd written was in response to CFCCA, and which is the Centre for Chinese Contemporary Art in Manchester, and there I encountered a situation where I felt that the work that I was being asked to produce couldn't manifest in that given context, because what I was being asked to refer to was my embodied experience, and yet somehow the organization felt like that it had not been able to offer a space to reflect on that embodied experience in a way that was more than being curious of it. And so there was somehow it felt that I was relaying something that was an expected stereotype. And this was just before the show was due to open in March. So I withdrew, I think, sometime in the beginning of March. But this conversation with them had been going on for quite a few months before that. And I was really uncertain about what would happen. And as the pandemic approached, and there was also this exacerbation of inequalities that we were seeing all around us, it felt that the organization was not only ignoring that exacerbation of inequalities, but also at the same time facilitating some inequalities. And that felt really alarming to me at that time. And I think then I went on to write another essay that reflected, a few months later, that reflected more on how we move forward from this, because I continued those conversations with CFCC, and I'm still in conversation with them now about how to move forwards from this position where we have what seems to be a space designated for contemporary art that it feels actually rather empty of purpose, feels rather empty of its publics and its people and its artists. It feels like a kind of empty gesture. And how do we then move into something that is an alternative way to think about organizing? And this is perhaps where care comes in. And I was very concerned that of the relations that we had as artists and curators. And I saw the institution as a place where I expected the people who worked there to think of themselves as practitioners, a place where they would understand that the things that they do, aside from the artworks, would create not only things in the visual, but also somehow things that were in the social. I would hope that they had understood that. And certainly as an artist, I have come to understand that the things that I make and the images that I create are much more than the visuals that they produce, and actually that they manifest in all kinds of varieties of the social that are perhaps invisible to me too. And I think I then recognized that that my participation as an artist somehow, and this is a real period of self-learning last year, but I began to realize that my practice as an artist, as it was and perhaps still is, was dependent on inequalities existing, and the inequalities were dependent on my practice, both as a human being and an artist. And I was really troubled by that. And since then, I haven't committed myself to any length of time in the studio, but instead, my practice has been manifesting in these conversations in an attempt to, I see a question there from Rachel Marsden about the difference between critical care and radical care. And these are the kind of questions that I'm still wrangling with. What even does the word radical mean? Because I'm quite lost at the moment as to what appears to be referred to as radical, because things that I consider to be obvious, other people would describe as radical. And I think that this is perhaps where I am at the moment, trying to situate myself in the set of relations that makes up contemporary art. And I think I've gone on for so long now, but the contemporary art is not some kind of large institution that we all work for. It's just a set of loose relationships that we can think of it as an ecology or an assemblage of practices or of behaviors that somehow generate social practices too, and social behaviors. And those relations themselves, in addition to what we produce as artifacts or videos or writings or utterances or whatever things that we make as artists, if those things are things that we value, but yet at the same time we have a problem with the way that those relationships are organized, then we really have to assess reassess that value. I think we have to think about what other forms of organizing might we look to produce this value, and whether or not that value is aligned with the kinds of complexities that it also produces. What? I'll stop speaking there because I want to hear from Sunshine too.
I just want to keep listening to you. Yeah, I guess to answer Winnie's question, I was about to say I was at a real crossroads at the early part of last year, but I feel like, to be completely honest, I've been at a crossroads of working in the arts my entire art career, you know, the last 15, 20 years or so. And it's this sort of chronic thing that happens to people who just do not have any sense of stability or self for a long period of time. And working in a Berlin context and later in the British context, but which was pretty hostile until maybe the last few years, when suddenly there's a shift in like, oh, inclusivity and diversity and all these sort of things. And suddenly feeling buoyed in my own practice. So this is maybe what privilege feels like. Oh, you know, people are actually interested in what I have to say and what I'm doing. And not knowing whether any of these sort of like feelings that you had about like previous, is it because of this? Is it because of that I was like this whole time just kind of hovering in the outskirts of the art world? Is it this? Is it just me? Am I like, you can't put two and two together because there's no two and two. It's just like these swirling, like I was saying earlier today about like trying to settle all the swirls. It's like these swirls that happen around you that you can't put your finger on. And it's just an atmosphere of like not rightness. And so I had just finished my PhD a year and a half ago, and that was such an arduous process. It was the first time in my entire art career where I had like, I only did it because it guaranteed me 3 years of income. You know, it was funded, I could, you know, but the upshot of that was my mental health and well-being, you know. And what did I learn from it at the end? I was questioning. It was a good thing to do, I have to say, much like in the last year, it has been a good thing to just sit down and have a moment of reflection. And I tried to use that as a way of reflecting on like what I was trying to do in art, you know, rather than asking what it is or, you know, what was I trying to do? And it felt like I was getting close to this idea of like, you know, the place it has in the world, or doesn't have, really, to be honest. Like, it doesn't really have a place in the world, but we as artists and practitioners are constantly trying to make a place for it in more or less successful ways, and you just keep doing it. And I think I'm coming to terms with that now, and that every day I'm trying to ask that question again of what is it doing, how do, and there's no real answer to it. And I think what JJ was saying earlier about like this set of relations has been really resonant on a personal and on an organizational level, only because the organization is 50% me. And thinking about how these relations need nourishing, need nurturing, and cannot just be like indefinitely extracted from. And having this understanding and sort of coming to some sort of peace with that means that, okay, what is it that we can do now slowly to make sure that these relationships are nurtured? And I think that the question, go on, please.
No, I think it's really fascinating to hear this kind of, you know, the kind of ambivalences and the entanglements of ideas of precarity, you know, precarity of labor and so on, and artwork, the work of art, and also ideas of, you know, obviously race and privilege, and, you know, how the complexities of those things, especially in the last, have kind of really dominated discourses in recent years for obvious reasons. in ways I hadn't quite before. I think that's something I think we should go back to talk about in a bit. But before that, I think we have a very interesting question as well from Charlie Gear to do with whether or not art education itself, thinking about these systemic structures, structures of institutional prejudice or bias and so on, might even be in effect perpetuated by art education and art institutions at university level, which is a question I ask myself very often as well. But I'm really curious to hear what you both think of that.
I think certainly, I think particularly higher education, because higher education at the moment feels very, and this is the result of a lot of policy for the last 15 years. And I was a student of Charlie Gear's not that long ago in 2012. But thinking about even just the change in education since I started university as an undergraduate, I think that more and more higher educational institutions are driven by a desire to expand, or driven by expansionism, is that a word? Expansionism, and a kind of market-driven managerial approach to producing, to being a producer, and somehow that doesn't really align with the with any kind of pedagogical agenda. That somehow business and education don't really sit very well alongside each other, because education is something that we think of as for the public, and business is something that is inevitably something that is self-serving, or at least in a very kind of shallow way. And yeah, so I think that this kind of business modeling of higher education, which models the larger institutions of this country and of other countries, means that the art school is part of that university, or as part of that model, becomes this space that at the same time is trying to nurture critique, nurture criticality, nurture these people who arrive wanting to invent something new. Nobody goes to art school with the intention of following the status quo. And then yet somehow, and I see this in my own students, somehow in the time that they're in higher education, they develop this anxiety that they need to somehow have a stability in a career. And this is because of the challenges of the economic system, that actually agility is not something that is going to get you any kind of sense of luxury, or a sense of wanting to, I think one of the other discussions that I have a lot within the university is there is a lot of discussion, and you'll know this too, I'm sure, when at the call told, about decolonizing the university. Now, when it comes to decolonizing the university, I think these two words are a bit of a contradiction to each other. And in order for us to conceptualize what it means to decolonize the university, which is essentially a structure that perpetuates the practices of the colonial, is that we have to, in essence, undermine it, or at least its present form, so that there is an ability to invent or come up with the ideas or speculate on some other thing that maybe we don't refer to as a university yet. Maybe it's this other thing. It's this other kind of organization, and maybe eventually it becomes a university. But at the moment, I think that it's too difficult, or it's too contradictory for us to think about the place that we are currently situated within academies or within our arts organizations, and to think of any kind of practice that we are doing as somehow having the ability to undermine it, without also trying to invent something that is situated outside. And so this is where I have the inside and the outside of or I suppose it's almost like having two sides of your conscience, but there is this tussle. And in order to reform the university into something else, it requires some kind of invention that at the moment the university is not willing to accept. It has to remain outside for the time being. And I think that's maybe how I would answer that question. But it's, again, it's something that I'm really struggling with myself.
No, I really hear you. Before turning to Sunshine to ask what she thinks about it, I think one of the issues that would be interesting to hear what your perspective is on that, touching again on what you said about your own artistic practice earlier, was this idea of the burden of representation, right? So within that structure, you know, the extent to which as a person of color, you're expected to speak to these issues to some extent, be able to answer to them, to educate, you know, on a level that might not be, which might, you know, in some sense perpetuate these systems of discrimination in the first place. Because I'm remembering how earlier you had mentioned that in a way, your status as an artist was to some extent dependent on some kind of a sense of inequality as well. And I think that's a very complicated, you know, kind of knot of different affects, right? Would you be able to speak about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you're right. I am called upon to speak a lot about inequality as something that, as a, you know, when I was an undergraduate, I certainly did not think that that would be the case. And yet, as I suppose I developed a voice, one as an artist, and two as an Asian body, a Chinese East Asian body, and those two things have elevated each other, but it is not without I suppose the privilege of being an artist meant that my voice as a Chinese body was heard louder than other people's.
Excuse me.
And certainly as an artist, my voice is not very loud in comparison to other people who also call themselves artists, I think. And so I found myself in this position attempting to amplify not only my own experiences, but the experiences of those around me, my students, who a lot of them have arrived from East Asia without a real concept of what it meant to walk down the street and encounter racism. And suddenly they were confronted with that. And that was something that maybe I'd grown up with and had almost dismissed because it felt so normalized. And Sunshine can speak to this experience too, because Sunshine is from Hong Kong and then and now lives in Northern England and in Sheffield, which has a relatively large Chinese community, but inevitably there is a general sense that that no matter what I sound like or what I act like, that I am perceived as an outsider, and also that there is always somehow a need to even in conversations about inclusivity within the university, there is a need to somehow understand non-white bodies as other than the university. That somehow those members of the university are members that somehow need to change or adapt through either mentorship programs or some kind of shift within a person to bring them up to the level of the university. And often the conversation is not related to how an institution or university might adapt to the needs of its people. And so there is this, the hierarchy, I suppose, is the problem. I don't know if that even made any sense, what I've just said, but I was thinking through it as I was saying it. But I think that genuinely that this sense of the non-political institution is also a major limitation to what an institution can do, or what an institutional body can achieve if it is just to skirt along with the status quos. And if we're going to even talk about what it means to be a researcher or to research, or if we're going to talk about knowledge generation, how can we be a conservative institution? I think there's multiple contradictions that I encounter in those spaces that really need to be complicated. And quite often I find myself in conversations not necessarily providing answers, because the answers that I have are all very speculative, but just there as a challenge that is both recognized as annoying, but also recognized as quite necessary.
Yeah, Rachel Marsden made a really interesting comment here about how the higher education's rhetoric of what it means to develop and build resilience is very rarely linked to care and practices of care as well, going back again to this kind of centralizing ethos that you and Sunshine are working through at the moment at this particular point in time. And I wonder, Sunshine, if you could talk a little bit as well about how, slowness, might be used productively in terms of that, because there's been a lot of talk about the machinery, the kind of accelerated 24/7 capitalist time and the wheel we can't get out of, and I guess also to some extent the very odd elastication of time under lockdown, and time playing tricks on us and so on. But I was very drawn to this idea of slowness that you have talked about previously. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Wow. Slowness has come into my life rather late in the day. Being from Hong Kong, everything is like, in Cantonese, we have the saying where it's like, some gup, your heart is beating fast, constantly. And you can't, it's something that feels so tied into being a Hong Konger. You don't even know otherwise, everything's just one after the next. And just the rhythm of the city is such that it makes it, it's like completely embodied in you. And I moved here 10 years ago. And in the last 6 years, it's been, there was the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, and which I was not there for and could only watch from afar, and seeing the whole city kind of come to a complete standstill, it's just mind-blowing for me. And I was watching it so closely on social media. Any friends and acquaintances I had there who were working in sort of like cultural adjacent ways were in the streets, and just so much extraordinary things were happening. These conversation circles, like these ad hoc desks that were put in the middle of Harcourt Road, which is a main arterial route that goes from Central to Admiralty, just like the main sort of business areas back home. And just seeing everything like just collapse in time, and people talking and just kind of thinking about what's going to happen, and seeing all of that. That was kind of like my first like real kind of like it really hit me hard, like how it all slowed down to the point of because it was a strike, and a strike, I guess, that's what it's about, like bringing things to a standstill. So there was that. And then there was my son was born 5 years ago, and the first year of motherhood, that's also basically time is everything and nothing. You're up at all hours of the day. You go by the rhythm of a child, which is completely disobedient of capitalist time. Obviously, they're not going to wake up at 8 and go to bed at when you want them to. They'll be up at 4 in the morning and be happy and want to play. So that was also another odd marker of time not necessarily having to go the way it does. And then the PhD was, as I said before, really arduous and long, and kind of coincided with pregnancy and motherhood as well, and just having to space out the day, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, with research, writing, and walking, if I were diligent enough to mark out that time for myself. Usually it's sitting in front of the computer and just hoping something will happen. And that was a really weird sense of time. It was 5 years ultimately of that total strange collapse of time. So I think it's only in the last 2 years of kind of working at Bloc and then working at Curator, and the last 1 year has also been weird, hasn't it? So it's just this slow reintroduction into everyone else's time frame, or the time frames we work within. And now that my son is about to enter reception, it's going to be that like time of, you know, half terms and summer and really getting embroiled, I feel, in even more deeply, you know, with embroiled, enmeshed, whatever, with that sort of system of time. So it wasn't a deliberate thing that we carved out for the Blueprints residency to do things slowly. We just wanted more time to work with an artist. What has happened, what has sort of like emerged out of these conversations with JJ, because this is all we have at the moment. They can't come up to visit, you know, they're stuck in London and I'm stuck here in Sheffield, is Zoom, you know, having to just talk things through. And we somewhat, I think now it's purposely, we don't set up an agenda for things and do a to-do list at the end. Whereas in the beginning, it was just like, we're just feeling out what this residency could look like. And I was trying to slowly and carefully explain, no pun intended, but also intended, carefully explain like what we were trying to do, hoping to do. So yeah, I guess we have these hour-and-a-half conversations where we allow things to kind of like expand and contract and expand and contract, and you do feel that flow of things happening. And I was saying to you earlier, Wendy, before this conversation started, it's really, really goes against my grain to not prepare for something, you know, really, really almost to the point of, you know, writing a script for stuff. And today I really was determined to come in and do it live, because JJ and I have been having these conversations every other week, and I feel like more prepared for it, you know, in a way. And also I really have learned in these conversations that things emerge. And what those things are, I mean, we don't have the time for right now, but like, yeah, this sort of slow pace of working has been really, really, has been a really important underscoring aspect at Bloc, where all the other mechanics are still churning, you know, because we still need to get project funding, we still need to deliver programs, and the world is reopening now. June is coming, and we've got a show opening. All of those things are happening, but I feel like Blueprints is that sort of, is existing in the in-between spaces, as well as the kind of like meta level almost. But I don't mean it at meta as in like it's far away, but like it's holding it together, almost like keeping it together, because I'm able to kind of talk some things through with them and with JJ, and that feeds directly back into how we approach the work, you know. So yeah.
Well, absolutely. I think
very convoluted answer.
Everything you've been saying is really valuable, and I think that there's a lot that's being revealed in a way. Also, understanding how an institution like that works, you know, it's been really fascinating to hear. And you know, I think this idea of, you know, the kind of dialogues that one can have, you know, through these different means of and channels of communication, inspired the name Zoom, which does seem to kind of feed into this kind of accelerated idea of time and so on, has been a kind of unexpected outcome. But at this point, maybe I would like to invite questions from the audience, while JJ, perhaps maybe you want to respond a little bit to this idea of slowness and how that might feed into your practice as an artist, you know, as someone who works with media, moving image and so on. There's a kind of, you know, you have that kind of capacity to be experimental, I think, in a way that's that's really intriguing. And a question from Nuria. Thank you, Nuria. For JJ, does the storytelling approach in your art research play a role in imagining this reconfiguration of art organizations towards practices of care? So not an unrelated question.
Yes, I think is the answer. I think I suppose my approach to storytelling, or maybe my general approach to making artwork from being somewhere in the middle of being an undergraduate, was always in an attempt to be very loud, because I realized that that it was harder perhaps for me to be loud outside of in the university. I was pretty loud, and I always made these really great, big, loud, obnoxious artworks. And Charlie Gear, I think, I described them as obnoxious previously, but they were this attempt to be something that could be seen. I had this immense fear that I would be invisible as soon as I graduated, and so the storytelling became this tool where I was able to add, I suppose, the multiple levels of nuance to that loudness. And so in the works, there are generally more than one form of storytelling, some writing or sound or video. Perhaps in an installation, there would be sculptures as well as the drawings, and this obnoxious in a good way, Charlie says, thank you. But yeah, there was this always this attempt, I suppose, to provide a platform for the story, and that's what it's only been very recently in the last few years that I've started to make work in Cantonese, because of this sense that the work in Cantonese would somehow be lost. And it wasn't until I managed to find the platform for it. The first work I think the first work I showed in Cantonese was a show in Sheffield, actually, at Portland Works. But the first time it had a really large public audience was at an academic conference at the RCA. And I was invited to contribute to this shared keynote on the urgency of the arts. And I made this short film, which I'd stolen from Cathay Pacific Airways flight to Hong Kong's safety video that was in Cantonese, and I replaced the words. And it was, I suppose, in reflection to this idea of slowness as well, because slowness to me is again another contradiction, because whilst there is slowness that is facilitated at the moment by Bloc, there is this aggression of the restarting engine of capitalism that is like chugging away in my other ear, and saying that you're going to get up at 10 a.m. you're going to be on Zoom until 8 o'clock, and so there is this immense speed at which I'm expected to operate. There is this the slowness at the same time as ability to think is needed, to think critically and to think at the pace, I suppose, of the emergence of inequalities. And maybe people think of inequalities as predominantly as like overt forms of racism, like down the street and being punched in the face. And actually that I think inequality is more often and more pervasive as this slow kind of violence that builds up and mounts up, and then somehow, people die from inequality. It's this, it's in itself a kind of virus. It's and it's in plain sight too, as Yun Fang Ling has just added in the chat. It's something that we all know exists. We all know is dripping along and forming these parts of our relations. Somehow, at the end of this set of relations are the peak of these inequalities. And yet, what we are often talking about is how do we reform institutions? And maybe that's also something we have to think about internally. How does our practice, or how do our everyday behaviors even contribute to what it is that we see in the world, in the social? How do the things that we eat, or the things that we do, or the things that we, the money that we accept, how do these things contribute to the social that we are so critical of, so that we are somehow suffering under? That is it that we are also complicit? And I think most of us would say, yeah, of course we're complicit, but actually that there isn't the action to accompany that sentiment. That was a little bit of a rant, so I'm sorry.
I don't think that was, I love it when you rant, actually. I think it's great. I think, you know what, one of the things that, and I'm really glad you kind of brought it around to this very important question, and that idea of the kind of slow accretive, you know, the kind of accretion of prejudice and violence that takes place over kind of a really long durée, I think is something that is very important. And also the speed and urgency in which we are expected, institutions are also expected to dismantle these things, right? Tear down a statue, you know, change everything overnight. And in that process, then what's lost? You know, there's not a kind of, you know, what kind of care must be taken in a way to really understand these systemic forms before we are quick to, I don't know, call for that self-destruction and so on. I was struck also by what you mentioned earlier, this idea of after graduating, you know, a fear of being visible, something that was a phrase you used, which I thought was very interesting. And there was a question earlier from Uthra, asking what you and Sunshine as well thought about the phrase people of color, and whether that places an emphasis on a binary division between whiteness and any type of other, essentially based on skin color, and is there a risk that this phrase homogenizes an entire body? And I think in the light of, you know, especially kind of anti-Asian discrimination and violence, which is not often, you know, granted the same level of visibility, right? You know, what is that shift from being a kind of invisible model minority to, you know, sort of an invisible population that is facing, you know, increasing violence and prejudice, and how does that all play into the, you know, terms like POC or whatever else that's been used now? Do you have thoughts on that? Or Usra, do you want to, if you're still listening, would you like to elaborate on that question as well? Sunshine, what do you think?
I'm just thinking out loud now, because I haven't really put like really sort of conscious thought into taking the term people of color apart. And I am also guilty. No, I don't want to say guilty. I also use that term because I feel like it does a certain kind of work as well. I don't feel like it's completely something that I don't think any terminology, frankly, is ever like, oh, this is the correct term or this is the correct term. It does a bit of work for a little while and then might be replaced by something else. You know, maybe in a few years' time, we can find another terminology that is more relevant to the work that needs to be done then. But I think for now, I find it quite useful to, well, again, it's on a personal level to use this and think about like the accretion of all the little things that have happened in my own life, you know, and what to name it and how to package it, if only temporarily, because it might change again in the future. But it helps at least for me to come to terms with some of the things that have happened in my own past. And growing up in Hong Kong, going to a very, very colonial school with more than half of the students were from British or other European backgrounds, and the strangeness of that, being situated in Hong Kong, you know, having to speak in English all day at school, not being allowed to speak a word of Cantonese because that was against the rules, except for when something went wrong with the leakage of some pipes, and then, oh, Sunshine, you speak Cantonese, can you get Mr. Lowe to come up and fix the pipes? Oh, then I can speak Cantonese, you know, that sort of stuff, you know, where I had absolutely, even until recently, no name for it. And not to say that people of color, but it's a collection of terms that help you kind of do the work of, you know, JJ was talking earlier about decolonization. And that is no super event, you know, at all. It's these tiny, tiny little moments that you sit and you mull, and then it's, you might be sat on the bus, or you might be having a conversation with JJ, or seeing my son who's mixed race suddenly say something in Cantonese to me, and how it hits me sideways completely, you know. All of these things are part of these moments of undoing and redoing and putting it. So I think in this sort of semi-convoluted way of answering the question, I feel like it does some kind of work, people of color. It might not be always the right term to use, and sometimes we need to differentiate maybe and talk about East Asianness. And recently I've been reading Anne A. Cheng's Ornamentalism, you know, and thinking about the yellow woman as well, and how that is also not like necessarily a reclamation of the term, but also doing a certain kind of work to think about like the peril of yellowness, or the sickness of yellowness. So it's not all pretty, or like, you know, yeah, I'm a yellow woman, but like, oh, yellow, what is that, you know? So yeah.
I think we have another task here, don't we? That it is that as the way that we speak and the way that we conceptualize what the meanings of those words is at the moment seems that we only think of things as having a definitive meaning, and that actually we perhaps would benefit from shifting towards a way of conceptualizing an idea or a term or a you know, some kind of description towards something that actually not only doesn't rely on a singularity, but in fact avoids it. And even within, you know, we can go to the kind of most specific kind way of describing a person's body. We can't still fulfill the sense of self that they are, the complexities that make that person who they are. Again, this set of relations that forms them, and so we really have to understand these terms, people of color, or other terminology that is used to describe people who are other than white, people of the global majority. We have to understand these as very complex words, and are complex in the sense that, not that it's difficult to understand necessarily, but complex in the sense that they mean a lot of different things at once, and that they refer to a lot of different things at once. And this the same, you know, applies to things like the internet, or you know, this is one of the lessons that I took from Charlie Gear and have drawn all the way through, is that the sense that the digital, being something that is all pervasive, can only really be understood if you understand the digital is more than this one definable thing. And that's something now that is like, you know, can we imagine, trying to imagine a world without a digital, is that trying to imagine a world without capitalism? That this is now something that is so derives our social lives, from which we derive our social lives, rather. So yeah, I think that we really have to allow ourselves to understand these terms as beyond perhaps what the words themselves might just mean, but actually the combination of words together create a meaning that is beyond just the literal sense of people who are not white. I think that's what our task is, all of us actually, including anybody who might count themselves in that group of people of color. I think the difficult terms that I have is BAME, because BAME attempts to name specifically, but yet doesn't at the same time. Whereas people of color is more ambiguous. And it's more in reference to, it doesn't attempt to specify, and at the same time, if we allow this complexity to occur, then it won't homogenize. And that homogenization is something we have to recognize is within us, within the way that we read. I think that's how I would come at those kinds of terms anyway.
Yeah.
I think that's really very well said, JJ. I just wanted to let the audience know that I was wrong. If you have a question, please type Q and Layla will unmute you, because apparently we don't have that function. I was just like, if you've got a question, just start speaking, whatever, unmute yourself. Apparently it's not possible. But I think, yeah, so I'll give you guys a few minutes, and if you have a question for JJ or Sunshine, please type a Q into the chat field, and then you will be unmuted and invited to speak. But I also wanted to add that JJ is very kindly doing a studio visit tomorrow at 1 p.m. where they will be talking about their work, their really fascinating practice in a lot greater detail. And I was just wondering, the last few minutes actually that we have, if we might give a little preview of some of JJ's work by maybe showing a video, perhaps. Is that a good idea? What do you guys think?
Sure, yeah.
I think maybe.
JJ, what do you think about that?
Yeah, sure. I had in mind another video, but I thought maybe in reference to slowness, I could show the film that we just mentioned there, that was originally made for the arts conference. It's only 3 minutes, so it's perfect timing. So I'll share screen.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really good.
So can you see the screen? Can you see a black screen is what I'm at. Yeah, okay, here we go.
喺咁樣嘅追逐中，喺咁樣嘅競賽中，有時我瞓低，為自己嘅片刻喘息感到罪惡，覺得呢個世界為咗我而停頓。快啲啦！但同時，有時候呢個世界提醒我行得太快啦。鄰近我長大嘅地方有個大型嘅購物中心，可以話喺附近嘅城鎮中好有名氣。當我仲細嘅時候，裏面有個遊樂中心，五顏六色，閃閃發光。喺佢嘅入口玻璃門嗰度，掛住一條巨大嘅機器電動魚。興奮咁想睇嗰條魚，我會跑向嗰個自動門，跑得好快，門仲嚟唔切打開，足夠讓我從門縫間擠過。唐突咁停低腳步，我企喺門前等住佢，慢慢咁打開。吸力嘅聲音以及暖氣嘅熱氣歡迎住我。最近我向其他人提起嗰隻電動魚，但冇任何人記得佢。我揾唔到任何證據證明佢曾經存在過，真係得意。之後喺遊樂中心關閉後，我試住複製嗰唐突嘅宗旨。喺屋企附近有一個好大嘅超級市場，內部被設計成好似老市場咁嘅樣，不過充斥住潮濕嘅瓷磚味道，以及冷生肉嘅味道。嗰度好暖，我哋有時會喺週日嘅時候嚟到呢度，喺餐館食西餐。我記得回顧起身，或者係一種抗議，我會用我嘅腳跟營造嗰急速嘅停止。嗰個旋轉門，隔一秒，時間會停止。我哋都等住嗰道門再次轉動，讓我哋能繼續我哋嘅人生。嗰一瞬間，我哋停低，咩事都唔可以做，邊度都唔可以去，互相睇住彼此。
There we go.
Thank you, JJ. That was really fantastic to see. I love how it's a kind of purloined from Cathay Pacific, safety video thing. And I was also struck by, I mean, it's especially strange to watch it now that I think most of us probably wouldn't have been on a plane for a really long time. So even watching a safety video seems quite exotic, I think, at this moment. But it's absolutely really, really. When did you say that work was made again? Sorry.
That was made in 2019, and that this was before the pandemic. It was a conference that was attended by people in real life, and yeah, so that's what it was made under that context, for in response, I suppose, just to the title of urgency of the arts and what it meant to be urgent. My urgency, I suppose, what I was trying to express in the video was that there was always a sense of urgency, but actually that I also felt an urgency to stop. And I certainly would wish that even as things feel like they are speeding up, that I would rather them slow down.
Yeah, there is that sense, this kind of creeping anxiety of everything reopening and people meeting in hordes and all that kind of thing. We have a question, actually, a comment and a question from Yuan Fengling. As a British Chinese artist, I feel the paradox of being a colonized body. The way I speak, my movements, the way I dress, etc. I wonder how a new sense of self and self-care might manifest or be cultivated as a result of COVID, BLM, and anti-Asian hate crime, which is a very good question.
How might a sense of self, I mean, our sense of self
and self-care.
Yeah, so this idea of self-care is something I suppose I'm relatively new to, actually. And this perhaps was allowed by that slowness that we referred to, and also a heightened anxiety of other people meant that somehow we had to think about our own bodies more, and not only what we were breathing in, but what we were breathing out. And so somehow I became much more aware of being situated in a body, and being situated in a body somehow drew my awareness to fatigue, to tiredness, to being overwhelmed, to depression, and actually that those were things that perhaps I had not considered were things that were within me before, until COVID had kind of become at the forefront of my consciousness. And I think that one of the things that has united a lot of sentiment that has resulted in the uprisings of Black Lives Matter, and also now what we see as the rallying of communities for anti-Asian hate through hashtags and social media events, and groups like the British East and Southeast Asian Network, which is just a group of young women who set up an Instagram account. And this way of understanding the self as partly connected to other people was, I think, really easily visualized when we understood that our breath was hazardous to other people. That we had suddenly, all of a sudden, we understood that ourselves were somehow implicit in not only the things that we were seeing, but actually the things that we were fearing. We understood that what we did on a very necessary level could result in somebody else's death. And so we understood ourselves as much more connected, much more entangled than we did previously. And so the sense of self, I suppose, that I have been developing and trying to conceptualize is that sense of self is something that is porous, I suppose, in a way that it is something that is leaking and dripping, but also something that is receptive. Something that I understand that the things that are impacting me have an impact on my sense of self and what I need to care for, but also I understand myself to be implicit in the selves of others. So that's where it is perhaps a very simplistic answer to that question, because it's very complex to try to draw these contexts together. COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and anti-Asian hate crime, although they are linked implicitly, they are also, we need to think about them also as separate. And the need for Black Lives Matter and the need for a kind of anti-Asian hate is pre-existed and will last longer than the pandemic, however long the pandemic is going to last. Even if it lasts for another 5 years, the conversations that we have in relation to Black Lives Matter will not go away. That somehow that we can't, I feel like there is at least I'm sensing, and this is perhaps pessimism, but I'm sensing that there is that there will be a dismissal of a responsibility towards tackling racism after the pandemic, because that somehow it would be justified that the pandemic exacerbated racism to such an extent that it became visible, and actually the problem is not actually that bad. And I think that that is a very real kind of sentiment that we might face after COVID-19 is not an immediate problem.
Or even according to recent government reports, that there is no institutional racism in the UK. That was announced recently. Even before the pandemic's over, guess what? Racism's been, cancelled, doesn't exist.
Right wing will always be quicker than it was on the left, because they are attempting to preserve something and we are attempting to invent something new. Inventing things takes way longer than preservation. And I think that that is the one thing that is really frustrating but can't stop us. That sentiment from the Conservative government is because they have an upper hand, because it's way quicker to justify an existing position and to try and reinvent something new. Anyway, I'll start going.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. So before I don't think we have any more questions, but perhaps very briefly you could talk a bit about when the exhibition, when we can expect to see some new, when we can go to Sheffield. I mean, what's going to happen? Who knows?
Yeah.
Give us a little teaser of then what to expect.
Yeah. Gladly.
And when?
Yeah. So our first exhibition that's opening up is on not a very auspicious day for Chinese people. It's on June 4th, but it's Gary Jesse Zhang's exhibition, and that will run until early July. And it's on risk universes and the financialization of risk through insurance industries. It's really, really interesting. But with JJ, we're hoping to do something between a couple of exhibitions in July, possibly for a couple of weeks in the second and third week of July, because JJ's residency is sort of existing in these in-between spaces. We're equally, in terms of doing events for them with us, gonna have to find these sort of like pockets of time between the programmed kind of exhibition-based stuff. So those are the two things. Yeah, we don't have any harsh lights coming up, probably not until July. Those are our online ones, very similar to this sort of format as well, where conversations are happening between two people. But yeah, I'll put Bloc Projects website in the chat. I don't know if people can see it, but if I put it onto, can it say everyone, panelists and attendees? Is that where I would put it?
So very soon you can visit Sheffield, and that project, we had considered how I might show work in the context of this residency, and it somehow felt very it didn't feel right to have a solo show or any kind of solo presentation. And so the show that's coming up in July will be a group show to visualize a set of relations. some of those people who are in the group at the moment who will be invited later on, but that it would be made up of the people who taught me and that I teach, all of which I learn from, and build this sense of self and also self-care. And so that's the premise of the show. And I've been toying with different ways of trying to verbalize the title, but maybe what I've got so far is What Do We Know Anyway? Is perhaps the title of that group show. And I think towards the end, what perhaps we will aim for at the end of the residency is the show of various works in progress that have emerged in this year, whatever stage they happen to be at. So that will come as we welcome in the next Chinese New Year in February.
Yeah, we've been quite good at taking notes during our conversations, and we hope to do some sort of publication as well at the end that hopefully will sort of chronicle some of the things that we've been discussing, and yeah, just put together all these really, really great insights that have emerged out of the conversation. So,
and of course we have to then invite the next artist in residence, which is the blueprints for the Otherwise residency, to then have a sense that they can undermine everything that we've come to conclude, because we have to maintain this level of agility, that it has to, whatever comes in place then has to be open to a kind of agitation from its people, from the people that it's surrounded. Otherwise it becomes this stability that again forms new status quos. So it's very important, I think, for whatever we do conclude with. Siri's trying to listen in on my conversation, whatever we do conclude with has the ability not to cement itself, but has the ability to be indeterminate, I suppose.
Yeah, forever remains a practice, sort of practice of the new, rather than sort of cemented into something that becomes a model. For instance, we talked about that, didn't we? Not wanting to have these sort of like models as if they can be sort of cookie cut and applied elsewhere.
One of the phrases that I've been working on this long-term project with Kate Davis, who is another one of my teachers, and we came up with this phrase that abbreviates to FUN, but actually stands for forever undermining the prevailing now. And I think perhaps that's a nice slogan that
that sounds quite fun. Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for participating today in a conversation that's been absolutely enlightening, and I think it's given us a lot to think about, and to continue, I think, reflecting as well on ideas of care, especially. I thought was very resonant now as a kind of ongoing concern in practice, an ongoing dialogue, I suppose, in a way. But thank you both so much, and thank you to the audience for your questions and for this evening.
Maybe opportunity to give a reading recommendation that I've only just recently encountered, which is available for free, which is a thesis by Adam Walker, who's recently become Dr. Adam Walker. His PhD thesis is on radical care, and it talks through his practice as an artist. How the radical care manifests in art practice. And I think that's, if you're interested in notions of care, this is not something that I read through yet, but it's certainly something that I have no doubt will be thought-provoking. So that's something that you can download from the RCA research depository.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for the recommendation. And thank you both, and thanks our audience, and see you, JJ, very soon, and hope to see you soon, Sunshine, in person somehow.
Yeah, please visit Sheffield, and we'll be.
Oh, I will, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Take care. Thanks so much for the
invitation. Take care.